words have power because we are kings and our words matter. When God made the earth and set it up for man, set up the Garden of Eden for man, God intended that it should be like a mini heaven. It some way should reflect heaven. It must be like heaven, his dwelling place. God wanted his children to live in a place just like he lives in.
Thousand times I've failed, your mercy remains. Should I stumble again, I'm caught by your grace. Everlasting, your light will shine when all else fades. Never ending, your glory goes beyond all fame. My heart and my soul, I give you control. Consume me from the inside out, Lord. Let justice and praise become my embrace, to love you from the inside out.
Romans 12, 19 to 21. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Paul, in all his injunctions here in these verses, from verse 9 all the way till the end, he tells us what not to do and what to do. So the most important thing that you should notice is there is a negative and positive. It is not that negative is not important. Negative is important. We need to tell people what not to do. But Christianity is not about a list of don'ts. But Christianity has a lot to do with what we must do. Since we are believers, since we are Christians, since we've been changed radically, then how we must respond to situations and to people in this life. That is very important. That is what living is all about, our actions and reactions. And that's what Paul talks about from verse 9 to 21. And today we're going to complete this teaching. And I showed you that from verse 14 on, he's been talking about our reactions to various situations and various people in our lives. Now, this world has become a very difficult place ever since the fall of man. God made it like a heaven. If you read the last two chapters of Revelation, it's very much like the first two chapters of Genesis. Because when God made the earth and set it up for man, set up the Garden of Eden for man, God intended that it should be like a mini heaven. It some way should reflect heaven. It must be like heaven, his dwelling place. God wanted his children to live in a place just like he lives in, with all the comforts, with all the good things, with all the peace and happiness, and every material thing available to them. That's the way God created the Garden of Eden and the world, and set up the Garden of Eden for man and placed man in that garden. But when man allowed sin into his life and listened to the devil, he had to come out from the Garden of Eden and set up his own world. Now this is where the problem comes in. Now the world in which we live in, that we have inherited from our forefather Adam and Eve, is a world full of troubles. This is a world that Adam set up after he was driven out of the Garden of Eden, after he lost the right to live in God's presence. When he came out in the wild, in the open, and began to set up a life for himself and a world for himself, and that's the world in which we live in. Now, this world is made up of certain elements that came as a result of sin. Sin has made human life very difficult. So today we have people filled with hatred, bitterness, jealousy, and all kinds of ill feelings towards one another. They're in a spirit of competition, living in a spirit of competition. So the world has become like a living hell, literally. It is not an easy place to live. So once you come to Christ, it's very important to come to Christ in this world, because God has never given up his original intention that we should live in another heaven-like atmosphere here on earth. Heaven on earth is God's will, believe me. Now, Christian people have a problem with it. I don't know why, I was preaching in a wedding about, I think I was preaching about prosperity and how to live successfully and prosperously and so on. The preacher sitting next to me in the pulpit there in the wedding, he said, "Here also you preach about prosperity, right?" I said, "Well, here only it's very important," because that young man seemed like he was perturbed by the whole situation that was getting married, He was looking at his wife and his new wife and the future life together and what all he's going to go through. I'm sure he's got a little job paying him a little money. I'm sure he was concerned about a lot of things, the material needs and so on. So I was addressing his thing, and I was telling him that God will bless him and they'll make a wonderful family. There's nothing wrong in it, but the preacher seemed to have some objection to it. And he said, "Here also you preach prosperity, But I believe that God's original intention is to put us in a place and give us a life that reflects heaven and its life there. We lost it through the sin of our forefather Adam. But now salvation is meant to bring us back into that kind of life, into that kind of a situation once again, and put us right in the middle of God's will for the best in our life. I have no question about that. I have no doubt in my mind what God wants for human life, that it is the Garden of Eden that still God desires, and it's a good life that God wants for us. There needs to be no doubt about it. But the thing is, the reality is different. Sin has come, therefore the world is a difficult place because people are different. They are filled with this sinful thoughts and sinful nature that makes the world a very difficult place. So one of the things that we need to understand in Christian teaching is how to deal with people, difficult people, who harm us, who do things against us, who act against us and do things that are harmful to us. What must our reaction be as a Christian, as a child of God, as one who has gone through a radical change and having been born again? How should I now live in this world? That's the major question. And Paul is addressing all of that here. So he puts it in the negative and in the positive way. He tells us what not to do and what to do. In verse 19, he talks about, it's talking about avenging, and says, "Do not avenge yourselves." Don't take it on your hand to avenge yourself. And I showed you why. Because we won't do a good job at it. Because we don't have all the wisdom, all the knowledge. We don't know everything. Plus, we are not fair like God. We are not just like God. So when we do a big blunder, we say it's a small mistake. But when someone else does a small blunder, we call it a big sin worthy of even death, That fire should come down from heaven and consume that person because he has done this. But when we do it or our children do it, it's just a small mistake that everybody fails to understand. Our perspective changes. In that way, we are all biased. Therefore, we are all unfair. If justice is left in our hands, if we are to avenge ourselves for the wrong done to us, if we are to pay back for the wrong done to us, we will invariably be unjust in doing so, and there will be law and order problem here, and there will be terrible difficulty and problem because we will never do it right because we are not at all fit to do that job. So God says, do not avenge yourself. That's verse 19. Leave it to me, he says. God says, leave it to me. I will take care of it. All right? So now Paul has told us what not to do. In the case of avenging, he says, don't take it on your hand. God is a better person to do it. He's all-knowing, all-wise, and all-good, and he will do the right thing. Now let's come to verse 20, because 20 talks about what we must do. Don't avenge, but what should we do now? If you're not going to avenge yourself, if you're not going to pay back that fellow who did wrong to you, who harmed you, if you don't have the right in the Christian faith to pay back to him and do what he has done to you and retaliate, then what should I do? Paul answers the question. Listen to this. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, therefore refers to the fact that God is going to take care of the vengeance. It's his job. Vengeance is mine. I will repay. Therefore, God says, I'll repay. So therefore, if your enemy is hungry, this is what you must do. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Now, don't avenge yourself, but how should I react toward a person who has done harm to me? It says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. Hunger and thirst is only an example that is used here. It doesn't mean only food and water. It is talking about how you should go out to help him in whatever way it is possible for you to positively help the guy who has harmed you, your enemy. Now, this is an Old Testament quote. This is very important to note. These kinds of things are very important these days. Because these days there is a trend, generally among Christians. And this trend comes and goes. You know, if you read history, Christian history, you will find that this trend started way back in the first century itself. There were people that said, Old Testament is not for us. We are New Testament Christians. I remember one time I met a fellow who had a New Testament in his pocket. I said, where's the rest of the Bible? He said, no, I don't think we need the Old Testament. We should forget about the Old Testament, just concentrate on the New Testament. I said, brother, I met another fellow who said, we should forget about the New Testament, just concentrate on the Gospels because those are words of Jesus. Why do we need the words of Paul and Peter and John and James and all these people when we have the words of Jesus himself? He's the authority after all. So forget about all those fellows. Let's have just Jesus, So he's got just the Gospels, the 4 Gospels. It's a wrong attitude. This thing began way back in the first century itself. There are certain people that infiltrated the church that brought in a heresy like this, that said the Old Testament is not for us today. We are not under the Old Testament. The Old Testament has no relevance to us, and the Old Testament is different. The trend of the Old Testament is totally different. It's contrary to the Christian spirit. New Testament is totally different. Christ is different from the Old Testament, and so on. I'll prove to you that it's wrong. That's why this is important. Paul quotes here the Old Testament from Proverbs chapter 25. Even in verse 19, it's a quotation from the Old Testament, and I showed you how that it comes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, and so on. Or Deuteronomy 32:35, rather. It comes from the Old Testament. That is, vengeance is mine, I will repay. God said it back there in the Old Testament. Now, if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if your enemy is thirsty, give him to drink, is also an Old Testament reference. Look at this. Chapter 25 of Proverbs, verse 21. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. And if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. For so you will heap coals of fire on his head. This entire thing Paul takes and quotes there. And the Lord will reward you. That little line is not there, but Paul quotes the rest of it. Now, why is this so important? It shows that to teach a New Testament truth to New Testament Christians, Paul is going back to the Old Testament and picking Old Testament truth. It is absolutely relevant. These people that say that Old Testament has no relevance to us are wrong. It is relevant. The principles of the Old Testament are relevant to us. Yes, there are some differences between the Old and the New Testament, particularly because we are now born again. We have the Holy Spirit living in us. and helping us to overcome sin and all of these things. You know, we have a different ability than they had. But still, the basic thing, everything is the same. The God of the Old Testament is not different from the God of the New Testament. Even Jesus read the Old Testament and approved the Old Testament completely. Remember the time they came and asked and said, can a man put away his wife for any reason? That's the question. They asked Jesus. Can a man put away his wife for any reason? Jesus immediately goes back to the Old Testament. He says, in the beginning when God created them, He created them male and female. This is His answer. Where did He get that from? Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, chapter 1 verse 27. In the beginning when God created them, He created them male and female. Jesus believed Genesis 1. And then He says, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. They shall not be two, but they shall be one flesh. Where did He quote that from? Genesis chapter 2. And I could show to you how He believes the entire Old Testament. Some people have the greatest difficulty with the first few chapters. They say, I can believe the rest of the chapters, but this creation business, that in 6 days He created the world, I can't believe. But Jesus seems to have believed it. And Jesus seems to believe that God created man as male and female. Now they say that there are so many other things also created. You know. But I believe the Bible, only male and female. That's what God created. Everything else man created. Some they created in Europe, some they created in America, some they created probably in India, everywhere. They create according to their own liking, but God created only male and female. That's it. If anybody is wiser than God, if anybody knows better than Jesus knows, what can I say? This is the way it is. Jesus takes the Old Testament face value. He believes it. He says, this is it. I believe it because the Old Testament says, because Genesis 1 says, because Genesis 2 says. That is why I need to point this out. This is a quotation from the Old Testament. Paul is teaching New Testament Christians a New Testament truth to born-again believers. He wants to tell them, do not avenge yourself, leave it to God. But what should you do? You should give your enemy food if he's hungry, water if he's thirsty. But by so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. This is an absolute Old Testament quotation, totally relevant for us today in the New Testament times. He uses the Old Testament quotation to teach that same truth here. The truth that was taught under the Old Testament, He uses it here in the New Testament to teach us the New Testament truth to the Christians. All right. So, if you think that Old Testament is not preferable, is inferior to the New Testament and all of that, and it is not relevant for us, then such a person does not understand the Old Testament and he does not understand the New Testament, How can you reject what Jesus accepted, These are things that you need to keep in mind as you live your Christian life and hear people say things, you got to be very careful because these are things that are very clearly evident in the Scriptures. How many times Paul goes back to the Old Testament and quotes authoritatively. Based on that, he teaches the same truth here in the New Testament. All right. But look at what he says. Give your enemy, if your enemy is hungry, give him food. If he is thirsty, give him to drink. In so doing, you shall heap coals of fire on his head. Now, this is the meaning that many people are waiting to hear, the meaning for this, because we all have people that we wish we could heap coals of fire on their head, I know a few, and you know a few, and oftentimes people ask me, what does this mean, brother? Because they're very anxious to somehow bring fire from heaven and put it on these people's head, because some people really deserve it also by the way they do things, So let me explain the meaning of this thing. A lot of people misunderstand. This is one of the most misunderstood verses in the Scriptures. They misunderstand it in this way. They think if you give your enemy food if he's hungry and drink if he's thirsty, the punishment of your enemy that will come upon him from God will be greater than what you can do for him. There is a tremendous ill feeling in some people towards their enemy. So they say, all right, Bible says give him food, give him drink. If he's hungry, give him something to eat. If he's thirsty, give him to drink. Then God will take care of him. When God gives it to him, he's not going to be able to get up. He's going to break his leg and hands. And he's going to lay him down in his bed for the rest of his life. When God gives it to him. See, people, I've been raised in the Christian circles. What I'm saying is not exaggeration. These are exact words I have heard many Christians and preachers speak in this way. When God gives it to a person, then that person will regret it for the rest of his life. And, God will break his hands and legs and make him sick and kill him also. And what they're saying is, all right, Bible says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give him to drink. I'm going to do it, but I expect God to kill him. I expect God to bring down fire upon his head and destroy him. Elijah brought fire upon the enemies of God. Certainly that must be God's will. So God will bring down fire. You remember the incidents in New Testament times when during the life of Jesus, they were passing through Samaria. Jesus sent the disciples to find a room for him to stay overnight. For him and the disciples. They went into the town, and because they were Samaritans, these were Jews, there were some racial problems between them. And so they did not even give them a room. They told them to keep walking, no room here for you. You are Jews, keep going to Jerusalem. They come and tell Jesus, and they say, these guys don't know who you are, how powerful you are. Elijah brought fire down on that altar. You can bring fire down on the entire Samaria. Samaria will be extinguished. They will not exist anymore. You are such a powerful person. Let's show it to them. These guys have the audacity to tell us to keep walking. Let's bring fire down from heaven. Destroy them. This is what the disciples said. It's amazing how you can be with Jesus and be his disciples and hear him preach every day and teach every day and see him set the example and still have a different spirit than what he had. When they said, let's bring fire down like Elijah and show these people who you are and the power that you have. You know what Jesus said? What kind of spirit you men have? He said, this is not the right spirit. This is not Christ's spirit. This is not the Christian spirit. It's totally contrary to the Spirit of God. Not right at all. Jesus rebuked them literally. So, a lot of people misunderstand in this way. They say, well, even verse 19, they misunderstand in the same way. I showed it to you. They say, all right, I won't avenge, because when God avenges, it'll be even better. That guy will get it even worse than if I did it. I can't break his hands and legs without being jailed for it. But when God does it, nobody can catch him, Let God do it, That kind of an attitude, Christian people sometimes do have this attitude. They think, he's done harm to me and he's going to get it from God. So Bible says, don't avenge yourself. I'm not going to avenge, let God do it. Bible says, feed him, give him drink, and God will take care of it. I'm going to do it so that God will punish him. The punishment that he gets from God will be like fire coming down from heaven on his head. He's going to get it good. Fire is going to rain down from heaven. This is the meaning of this verse. It is not. If that is what you think this means, then you've totally missed the point of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be Christ-like. Totally contrary to the Spirit of Christ. It is not what is meant here. Then what is meant here? What is heaping coals of fire on his head means? Notice, Paul did not say, don't avenge yourself, leave it to God. God will heap coals of fire on his head. That's not what he said. He said, don't avenge yourself, leave it to God. If he's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him to drink. In so doing, that so doing is very important. If you do that, by doing that, if you underline that, it'll save you a lot of trouble. In so doing, because you do that, and by doing that, coals of fire shall be heaped upon his head. Now, what is this thing about coals of fire? Certainly, it is metaphorical. It is not literal. Nobody's going to bring a pot of fire and put on somebody's head. It's not talking literally, it is talking metaphorically. Everybody understands that. But then what is it referring to? It is referring to some kind of a pain and anguish, some kind of a severe discomfort that is caused to that person. It doesn't mean actually somebody coming and putting some fire on somebody's head. It means metaphorically that some kind of pain and anguish and suffering, or some kind of a discomfort will come to that person. Not physical pain, but the pain of shame and the pain of remorse.
I will rejoice. I'm gonna lift my voice and worship you. Glorify your name among the nations. Oh, I will rejoice. In everything I will give thanks to you. For you have been my help and my salvation. I will rejoice. I'm gonna lift my voice and worship you. Glorify your name among the nations. Oh, I will rejoice. In everything I will give thanks to you. For you have been my help and my salvation. Every step I take, I feel your love around me. I cannot escape your grace. I cannot explain the blessings that surround me. I can only sing your praise. Oh, I will rejoice. I'm gonna lift my voice and worship you. Glorify your name among the nations. Oh, I will rejoice. In everything I will give thanks to you. You have been my help and my salvation. I will rejoice. I'm gonna lift my voice and worship you. Glorify your name among the nations. Oh, I will rejoice. In everything I will give thanks to you. That you have been my help and my salvation. I made a choice to offer up thanksgiving, lifting up your holy name. I will lift my voice, come before you singing with a sacrifice of praise. So I will rejoice. I'm gonna lift my voice and worship you. Glorify your name among the nations. Oh, I will rejoice. In everything I will give thanks to you. For you have been my help and my salvation. Everybody, oh, I will rejoice. I'm gonna lift my voice and worship you. Glorify your name among the nations. Oh, I will rejoice. In everything I will give thanks to you. That you have been my help and my salvation. You've been my help and my salvation. Lord, you have been my